Welcome to chapter 11. And we have been working in our block focusing on corrections. Remember, corrections is the third primary component of the criminal justice system. And so we spent the first chapter focusing on community corrections. It's still a form of corrections. However, it's a situation where an individual stays in the community. Now, this chapter, we want to talk about institutional corrections. In other words, what does it mean to be locked up? What are some of the places that you can go to if you are incarcerated? Now, when we look at institutional corrections, what they are facilities used to detain individuals in the criminal justice system. So someone has broken the law. The police have taken them into custody. Before they even go see a judge, they will go to jail. Now, for some people, understanding that just as we have a history of policing, we have a history of courts, we have a history of corrections too. Like, we didn't get to our jail and prison systems that we have today just by the snap of a finger. Like, it took time. And so in early America, jails were considered holding pens for those waiting to go to trial or those waiting to receive corporal punishment. We will talk about punishment shortly. When looking at punishment, though, before we get into more specific types of punishment, corporal punishment could be a beating, could be a whipping, it could be a caning, it could even be the death penalty. But jails were seen as these holding pens to coerce individuals to pay their debt, or if they were not conforming to the normal religious system, it was brought about to get them to submit to what the conventional religious norms were. And again, we're talking about early colonial America. So the early years were very brutal, right? Punishment in early America and early colonial America was based on this philosophy of lex talionis, which calls for retaliation, which the punishment should fit the crime committed. Essentially, lex talionis is the same as retribution. It's the same of Hammurabi's code, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth doctrine. And when looking at these early years, punishment was very cruel, it was barbaric, and it was even sadistic. Now, I don't know if you are listening to this lecture and you enjoy pain or you enjoy torture, but I could not imagine having to go through some of the methods we're going to talk about in just a minute. Either way, punishment was designed to send a clear-cut message that crime will not be tolerated. And so the sentences included death, including fines, physical punishment, and even public shaming. And listen, when it comes to public shaming, I know there may not be a feeling today that if you were publicly shamed or ridiculed, it's the end of the world. But for some people, there are, right? For some individuals, when their name is dragged through the mud or they lose credibility with the public, it is like the end of the world. Imagine what it was back several hundred years ago when you didn't have the technology you had today. If the public or the community or the village knew that you were a bad person, it was like getting a death sentence because you had nowhere to go. It wasn't like you could just pick up and go start over at a new place. Doing that was considered a death penalty because you didn't have a sense of community or a sense of belonging. So I want to talk about some early types of punishments. And of course, I've included some images to kind of help you understand what this type of punishment was. The first one was hanging. Hanging was used in the early days of the United States for the worst offenses. Essentially, if a person did something that was so egregious, so unconventional, their punishment could be to be hanged. Now, you look right here, and I remember sharing this with a class a few years ago, and everybody's like, what? And this was a big class. This was a class of over 170. But in 1642, 17-year-old Thomas Granger was convicted of having certain relations with a female horse, cow, goats, sheep, calves, and a turkey. He was hanged. So the 17-year-old Thomas Granger was hanged, and all of the animals were executed for their participation in the act. Now, the reason why the class laughed, they didn't laugh because 17-year-old Thomas Granger was hanged. That was wrong. That was a bloodline that potentially ended, at least with him. They laugh because how can the animals, the cow, the goats, the sheep, the calves, the turkey, how can you execute them for their participation when they're an animal? They had no say in what was going to happen. But that just goes to show you how extreme and how brutal punishments were in the early days. Today, Thomas Granger would have absolutely been charged criminally. He probably would have gone to jail, maybe prison, but you wouldn't have executed him or the animals, right? It just shows you how different the times were several, almost, well over nearly 400 years ago. Flogging. Flogging is a serious beating or whipping with a cane, whip, or rod. Believe it or not, flogging continued as a punishment up until 1952, which is when the final flogging occurred in the United States. So flogging's been out of commission for about, 73 years, give or take. But as you see on your image to the right, that individual will be getting flogged. Mutilation, amputation of body parts to curtail a perpetrator's ability to reoffend. If you like to steal, maybe they cut off your finger. Maybe your pinky finger gets cut off. You steal again, maybe it's your index finger. So now you're missing, this finger and this finger, right? But then you steal that third time and it might be like, okay, we're taking your whole hand. But they're going to mutilate you to keep you from stealing. So it's a constant reminder that you're losing vital digits on your body for breaking the law and for stealing. Now the gossip's bridle or the scold's helm, and that's what you see to the upper right of your screen. That's a heavy iron device that covered an offender's head. And so what it would include is a flat tongue of iron. Sometimes that flat tongue of iron would be made of spikes. They would put it on your head. It was super heavy. You would have to stick out your tongue, and you would have to put the flat tongue of iron in your mouth. And it would either go over the tongue and it's flat and it's heavy, so you would walk around with that for a period of time, or the spikes would pierce your tongue, causing bleeding and, a serious form of punishment. But the gossip's bridle or the scold's helm, very, very, very diabolical in terms of a punishment back in, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Now, branding served as a record to alert others of past offenses. So as you see, what do you think that T stands for, right? It stands for thief. T stands for thief. If you had, SO, it probably would stand for sex offender. M would probably stand for murderer. But they would brand a person to show them, or to remind them of what type of criminal they are, but also to remind the public that this is who this person is. They are a thief. Beware. Watch out when you're around this person because they can steal things. Now, first-time offenders will get branded in the hand, just like you see in the image. Repeat offenders will get branded in the forehead. It's possible to get branded in your hand, and you can kind of hide it. Maybe wear a glove. You shake someone's hand, you always have a glove on. You don't want people to know you're a thief, right, or a murderer, or a pervert. But eventually, if you get branded in your head, you can't hide that. They're going to see it, and they're going to know who you are. Now, women, they were rarely branded out of a form of respect or as a form of respect because of how humiliating it would be and how painful. But instead, they would have to wear marked clothing. And if a woman chose not to wear the marked clothing, she probably would be flogged or she would probably be whipped. And then, of course, the last one are the stocks and pillory, is what you see up in the upper right side of the screen. The pillory is generally force the offender into a standing position. Hands, heads, and ears are commonly nailed to the pillory board. So you've probably seen this in cartoons or movies, but a person has their head sticking in and their hands, and they have to stand there. And what do? People would toss items at them, rotten meat, tomatoes, what you see in the movies or the cartoons, throw other fruit at them, throw, lettuce at them, spit at them, might even throw rocks at them. I mean, I would have my eyes closed the whole time because you don't want to get a rock in the eye or get some rotten meat in the eye, but still, getting hit in the face with it is going to hurt. Now, the stocks, on the other hand, they were the same as the pillory, but the person's in a seated position. And generally, with the pillory, your feet would go through it. So they probably will walk by and whack your feet. So eventually you might have a broken ankle from getting whacked so many times on the feet. So we could not have a correctional system or a form of corrections in our society where beating someone, hanging someone, flogging somebody, making them wear the gossip's bridle, etc. We could not have that continue. We had to move towards a more humane treatment. And so the Pennsylvania system, or the Pennsylvania model, was the initial model used primarily where a person is isolated and they're silent and they have to reflect on their actions and they have to go through rehabilitation, but they are locked down 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 24/7. This was the separate system. What we started to see was a development which was known as the New York system or the New York model. And this is where, yes, inmates were housed separately and they weren't allowed to talk, but during the day they congregated for work and meals. That's why it's known as the congregate system, and sometimes it's known as the Auburn system. So ultimately, in my corrections class, when I've taught corrections in the past, prisons today primarily follow the New York system or the New York model, where yes, inmates can interact with each other. Actually, it's a variation of it. They can interact with each other. They do work together. They do have meals together. They do have communication. It is not complete isolation and silence as the Pennsylvania model or system would require. So when looking at contract and convict leasing systems, inmate labor was widespread, and two systems of inmate labor dominated early corrections. So convicts would develop skills and have appropriate work habits for reformatory purposes. But what you're going to see is that individuals would utilize convicts and individuals who are in jail or prison because they're a lot cheaper than hiring honest, good working people. Even though those people need to make a wage or a living to take care of their families, it's so much easier to get someone who's incarcerated. So there we had the contract system, and this is where prison officials would sell the labor and services of inmates to private contractors. There's a fixed price per person per day. So you have somebody who's in jail or in prison rather for a substantial period of time, and the prison official illegally would say, we're going to sell you 10 of our strongest inmates for maybe $2 a day per inmate. So 10 times 2 is 20. So you're paying $20 a day. But imagine if you hired legitimate non-criminal help, instead of paying $20 for 10 people, you might be paying somewhere between 5, 7, or 8 for just one person. And so if you do the math and get 10 people, you're talking $80. That's a lot of money back then. But $20 is nothing for 10 very strong men. The other side was the convict leasing system. And this is where private businesses paid the state a fixed annual fee for control of inmates who were incarcerated. So instead of just contracting, they would just go ahead and say, hey, we're gonna pay you one annual fee, and now we're controlling the inmates and you're leasing them to us. Again, this is still a problematic system because you could be in prison expected to get some programming or counseling or whatever, and turns out that you've already been put up for lease. So for the next year, you're Monday through Friday or Monday through Saturday, you're going on some farm or you're doing some type of work for an individual who purchased your services. And again, they paid this fixed annual fee to the prison. Now, the forced labor didn't enrich those who were in prison. Monies gained from the convict labor, they were used to fund the facility or enrich the lives of the prison officials. So controversies obviously existed because one, you have prisoners doing all this hard work when they shouldn't have, but two, it was very illegal. The contract and the convict leasing system was considered illegal. The courts would never be okay with inmates just going and doing work for private contractors and businesses because that defeats the purpose of being in a penitentiary and trying to correct your behavior. The most notable controversy is found in these pictures. And unfortunately, in the Reconstruction itself, in other words, after Reconstruction, and I'll talk about this in a second, even though slavery was abolished, you still had people of color getting picked up for minor charges under something called slave codes, and they would go to jail, and they would absolutely fall victim of the contract in the convict system. They would absolutely be used as labor, and oftentimes, more often than not, it was black men, people of color, who ended up being the ones leased out and put out on loan because minor offenses that would result in longer prison sentences. So when slaves were emancipated, it was thanks to the 13th Amendment, which was signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln on January 31st, 1865. Now, the great thing about just real time is that as you all are going through this lecture and going through this video and this module, you're going to hear this during the week of Juneteenth. Juneteenth is celebrated June 19th every year. It's the last and most recent federal holiday signed into law by former President Biden. But we celebrate Juneteenth because word didn't reach Galveston, Texas until June 19th, 1865, or 6 months after President Lincoln signed the bill. So that means from essentially January 31st, February 1st until June 19th, people in Galveston, Texas, which was the last place to be emancipated, they were still working as slaves and didn't know that they were free men, that they could have walked off that plantation. Isn't that something? And that's why we have June 19th or Juneteenth. But black codes, as I said before, they were statutes primarily found in the South, and they trivialized minor criminal behavior. Why were black codes important, especially since slaves were free? Because just what I said, black people were needed to work those fields and plantations, and this was the quickest way to pick up labor. So again, you would have people that would work these fields that would have previously worked these fields because they were slaves, but now we can quote unquote codify it and legalize it because as long as they've done something, they don't have a job, they did maybe jaywalking, maybe they talked to someone they weren't supposed to talk to, it doesn't even have to be a major crime. Once we pick them up criminally, now we get them back into those fields under the contract and the convict systems. So in talking about contemporary jails, think about the difference between a jail and a prison. You've probably seen a TV show where somebody went to jail. You probably heard of a TV show or watched a TV show or watched a movie where somebody was in prison. The biggest thing is that when it comes to jails, local facilities designed to house individuals who are arrested for any number of crimes, they're short-term placements. That's a jail. The jail is the place you're immediately going to go to class once you are arrested. So you're not going to go straight to prison. You will go to jail. And typically jails are run by the sheriff. We talked about how the sheriff is an elected law enforcement official, whereas the chief of police is appointed by the city council or the mayor. But there are some jurisdictions, not many, where the city or county run the jail. However, in a majority of jurisdictions, the sheriff is the person who runs the jail. Now, jails are, they house people awaiting trial. Typically, people will serve less than 1 year in jail. They may have been convicted or they just may be awaiting sentencing. But in most instances, a jail is just nothing more than a short-term facility. Now, can you have somebody sit in jail for, a couple of years, several years? Yeah, and you see that on murder charges and serious offenses. But for the most part, a person that goes to jail typically can be in and out within about 14 days, give or take. The average length of stay, if someone was charged, is about 28 days because you get a lot of people with minor offenses who go to jail as well. Now, jails, unfortunately, will keep people who can't afford to pay bail or pay the bond. And remember, we talked about how much a person needs to bond out of jail. That percentage is 10%. So if you got picked up on a charge and you went to jail and bond was set at $1,000, or bail was set at $1,000, you only need $100 to bond out, and you don't even have that, you're going to sit in jail, even though you only have to pay $100 to get out. Doesn't matter. You're going to sit in jail. If jails are short-term correctional facilities, usually designed to keep a person until they are sentenced, or they could be sentenced, usually up to a year, we have to look at prisons and what they are. And they're long-term placements designed to house convicted offenders serving sentences of over 1 year for felony offenses. So earlier in this, a few weeks ago, we talked about what does it mean to break the law, commit a crime, whatever. And we talked about there's two types of crimes, right? There's a misdemeanor, which is less serious, and a felony, which is more serious. And generally speaking, yes, a person can go to jail on a misdemeanor. If you steal something from Macy's, or if you go to a restaurant and you eat $300 or $400 worth of food and you don't pay and you try to run off and they hold you down till the police come, they'll take you to jail. Depending on the value, it still may be a misdemeanor, but if it's a high-end restaurant, it could be a felony. However, when we look at prisons, anyone getting sentenced to a year or more on a felony offense, they will go to prison. You won't go to prison on a misdemeanor offense, I promise you. You can't go to prison for theft. You can't go to prison for just a standard fight. You cannot do it. You can go to jail for those, but you cannot go to prison. And so we know that people in prison could be there for any number of felonies. You can see what those felonies are. But when they go to prison, what will happen is that a classification review will be conducted. And all this is an assessment made to determine the offender's risk levels and needs. How risky are they? Is it okay for them to be around a certain group of people? If they are, a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, do you want them in general population? Especially if they look very feminine? I don't think so. You're probably going to want to put them in an isolation, or if you have the capacity, in a unit with other people who identify in that demographic. But either way, classification is important to assess what their risk level is and also what their needs are while they're in prison. And you do classification in jail too, but it's very important in prison because these are long term. You're talking about somebody that might be there for a year, someone that might be there for 5 years, someone that might be there for life. So I want you to ponder this question. Why do you think that the United States incarcerates more people in jails and prisons than any other nation in the world? Why is that? We live in the freest nation. We have the best democracy. We have arguably the best economy. We're the one nation in this world where you can wake up tomorrow, no matter where you are, no matter how old you are, no matter what you are or where you're doing or what you're doing in life as you're listening to my lecture, or you just stumbled on this page. You can go make anything of yourself. Yeah, you might not have the skills to do it, but you can go to school. You can apply for grants or financial aid or loans, whatever. If you have the means to pay for it yourself, you can do that right here in America. Despite us being the land of the free and the home of the brave as we are barreling towards the 4th of July in several weeks, why is it that we have more people incarcerated in jails and prisons than any other nation in the world? Well, the answer is kind of simple. It's a little complex, but it's kind of simple. First of all, we have a punitive sentencing mindset. In other words, our mindset is to punish people. We have mandatory minimum sentences. In other words, when a person commits a crime, they have to undertake what's called a mandatory minimum. In other classes, we get into this and we talk about it extensively. The war on drugs. I love talking about the war on drugs and corrections. I don't typically talk about it in other classes, though. But the war on drugs is a big one. It was started by President Richard Nixon around in the 1970s, I think 1978, maybe 79. It was started by President Richard Nixon. But that was the war on drugs, and it was a colossal failure. Either way, we've struggled compared to other democracies because, as you see with this graphic, look at the incarceration rate per 100,000. We're locking up 655 people per 100,000. Our closest nation is still behind by about 483 inmates. That is insane. The Australia at 172. Our closest neighbor besides Canada is the United Kingdom. We look at overseas, Great Britain, they're doing 139. You look at these democracies, and this is data that was taken by the Federal Bureau of Prisons and other research entities. Why are we essentially quadruple what our next closest developed nation is? It's hard to say. But when you look at our mandatory minimums, when you look at our get tough on crime policies, when you look at politicians who are saying we're locking people up and we're not having crime, this is why we see our incarceration rate so much higher than the entire world. So in looking at institutional corrections, in prisons, they are broken by security level. You have your most high security level, the supermax. What you're seeing on the left is absolutely probably a supermax. It also could be a max, but you see that razor barbed wire? Yes, good luck going through that. If you can get over that wire, let's say you're Spider-Man or, the Hulk, and you can jump over stuff and leap over stuff, Superman, hey, you deserve to be out. But if you're just a regular person and you don't have any superpowers and you're climbing that fence, first of all, you can't even climb up the fence because you see all that razor wire at the bottom. That's going to slice you up. So if you get sliced up and you're like, nah, I'm still good, I'm going to bleed out, but I'm going to get over, you're probably going to be slicing up major veins and arteries going over the top. It's not happening. That's a supermax. Most restrictive, most secure, reserved for the most dangerous offenders. We have a maximum security prison. It's also a very secure facility, houses death row inmates. Then we have the medium security that house inmates who have committed less serious crimes. Again, very serious. These are still felony offenses, but not as serious as your murderers, your bombers, your terrorists, those criminals, your most notorious gang members. They're going to supermaxes and maxes. The minimum, mostly nonviolent white-collar criminals, someone who poses little to no risk. That would be a minimum security prison. And, what I want you to think about, too, is could you survive in a prison? Could you live in a supermax? Could you try to escape one? As again, I'm showing you what the barbed wire is. Like I said, you might be an incredible athlete that can get a running start and it can dive over those initial 3 rows of barbed wire. Wonderful. But how you getting over the other rows of barbed wire without cutting yourself? It's going to be a very daunting task. So lastly, when looking at prison populations, as of last year, because one thing I want you to understand is data takes a while to pull. It just takes a substantial period of time. Data is not something that you can just snap your fingers and get. It takes time. As of the spring of 2024, nearly 1.8 million people were in prisons. Now we're just talking prisons. We're not talking jails, because you're always going to have people in jails. Jails are mostly overcrowded, but prison is where a lot of data focuses because these are long-term facilities, and these are people that are there for felonies. The highest female incarceration rate was found in states like Oklahoma, Kentucky, and South Dakota. Again, not sure why those states had higher female incarceration rate. It's a little bit of a mystery, but those states just seem to have a little bit of more of a tougher stance on female offenders. Several states incarcerate more than 1% of males. So, for example, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Mississippi, a lot of southern states, they fall into that category. But prison populations are declining, particularly because, one, we have been looking at best practices, for example, looking at programs to try to keep people not only out of jail, but eventually going to prison and giving them second chances, but also because crime is still dwindling. Even though murder is a crime that keeps going up, other criminal offenses have been declining and decreasing. So the 1.8 million was certainly down compared to, the prior years where that number was hovering nearly at 2 to 2.2 million. But either way, the issue that becomes is that when looking at prisons, fewer serious offenders are being diverted to community corrections, because the consensus is if you did something very bad and you did something very serious, you can't stay in the community. You are a danger to the community, a danger to yourself, and more importantly, a danger to others. And if you are deemed a danger to others, prison is the place you will be. So we're going to stop there. You see this little blue man breaking out of prison. He's free. I want to thank you for certainly tuning in as we've shifted gears talking about jails and prisons. Again, major takeaway, the easiest takeaway. Jails, short-term facilities, they can house anybody for any offense. Traffic offenses, misdemeanor offenses, felony offenses, warrants, civil things where they didn't show up, or, but that's what a jail is. It's a short-term facility. Some people can be sentenced to jail where they can be sentenced to up to what they call a year and a day in jail. So 366 days in jail. Prison, on the other hand, are long-term correctional facilities where you're going to be sentenced to over a year. And typically, it's away from a jail. It's a very difficult place to be. You got different security levels, like the supermax, the max, the medium, the minimum. And in order to go to prison, you would have committed a felony. You will not go to prison. I repeat, listen to me loud and clear. You will never go to prison on a misdemeanor. You can absolutely and will absolutely go to prison on a felony. So again, I want to thank you for tuning in. We have one more chapter and then we are done with our block on corrections. In our next chapter, we're going to talk about parole, and we're going to talk about other institutional habits of what it's like to be in prison. Thank you for tuning in. Stay safe, and I will see you next time.